whatever type of software technology or technologies you might be considering for your organization. How do I do it? What are some of the things I need to think about? I think traditionally, we kind of intuitively know that you go do some research, you contact some vendors, maybe you put together an RFI or an RFP, you get some demos, and ultimately you make a decision based on that. But it can be overwhelming, especially when there's so many options in the marketplace, and especially when you have vendors who will tell you what they want to tell you, or tell you what you want to hear, which is that their software is awesome and amazing and all this good stuff. And oftentimes you get into this analysis paralysis of, well, everything looks good, or everything I'm seeing looks good, or I've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 options and I can't really decide, or I can't figure out the differentiators between those. And when you're looking at an entire organization, an entire set of functionality across technologies, that can be overwhelming. So that's really what I want to dive into here today is how do we go through that process, and what is it that we should be thinking about as we evaluate potential technologies. Before we dive into the sort of the nuts and bolts of evaluating software, it's helpful to sort of back up and look at some of the pieces within an overall digital strategy. So certainly enterprise applications and technologies, which is that third row you see here on this slide, that's certainly a key part of defining a digital strategy. You want to look at the industry landscape, create a long list, a short list, narrow it down to whatever system or systems might be the best fit, or whatever technologies might be the best fit. And then ultimately you move forward with the implementation planning and the implementation itself. But there's a lot more to it. There's a lot of other pieces that need to be considered as part of that evaluation, not just the software. So when we're looking at our overall digital strategy, we also have to think about what are our current and future state business processes. Where are we at today? What are we trying to enable in the future? What kind of improvements do we want to see in our business processes? That whole work stream is critical to the whole evaluation process, which, by the way, that whole work stream also becomes the foundation for implementation if you do it right. So you sort of kill 2 birds with the same stone, where you've defined business processes in your future state and the requirements. You use that to help evaluate and pick the right technology, and you use that same framework to implement too, from a requirements traceability perspective and from a overall quality assurance perspective, just to make sure that what you implement reflects what it was you were trying to get in the first place. And then you have the organizational change piece, which I know we've talked a lot about organizational change on and off throughout this conference so far. And that's a really important piece that starts during the evaluation, or it should start during the evaluation process. So this is where typically when we're working with clients, we'll do an organizational assessment to understand the culture, the nuances, the likely areas of resistance, the sources of resistance within an organization. And a lot of times this is hard for organizations to get their head around, why do I need to be thinking about change management now when all I'm doing is selecting software? And this is really important. It's an important nuance and important thing to clarify, because we need to understand what the impact on our organization is going to be with any given solution. For example, if you go implement a super rigid, structured, standardized ERP system that's a single ERP system that you're going to use throughout multiple locations throughout the world, that has a different impact on your culture than if you were to deploy a best of breed or open source technologies or things that are a lot more flexible. They might give you a little more flexibility. Those are 2 different impacts on your culture that ultimately affect how people will adapt to the change or not, or where the resistance will be. And it also helps us determine what the implementation timeline might be as well. So that's a key part that we need to consider, is making sure that we understand the overall change implications as well. And then we also have to look at solution architecture. How will our technology or technologies tie together? How will they tie to other third-party bolt-on systems? What are those touch points going to look like? How are we going to integrate systems? How are we going to migrate data, ensure that we have master data management in place, all that good stuff. So that's part of the overall strategy too. And then last but not least, you have your business intelligence and analytics. So we want to also understand what it is we want to get out of the system, what kind of reports, predictive analytics, business intelligence, all that good stuff. And ultimately that affects our overall strategy and plan as well. And then you have quality assurance, which underlies the whole process or runs in parallel with the whole process. So when we think about enterprise technologies and evaluating potential technologies, we have to think about it here from the perspective of the big picture of our overall digital strategy. Now, when we get to, and actually before I move on, I'll just look at the poll results here. It looks like about 2/3 of you are considering ERP systems. And then 25% of you are considering nothing or none of the above. And then one of you have something other, and a few of you have dropped comments that Kyler mentioned around ERP, CRM, warehouse management. A couple of you looking at SAP and Ariba. So good for the good variety of responses here. So thank you for the feedback on that. So the software evaluation and selection process, this is the sort of the 9 major buckets of things that we typically look at when we're helping clients evaluate technologies. And the first thing we do, starting at the top left here, is we'll look at the overall, the project review and kickoff. So that's where we'll look at, what are the expectations of what this project means to the organization, what current documentation might already exist. A lot of times organizations will have as is process documentation. It might be outdated, might be years old, but it gives us a place to start. So we at least can absorb and understand the way the operations run, or at least the way they were intended to run. And then we get into the executives and strategic alignment. And that's a really important step, because first and foremost, we have to make sure that whatever technologies we're evaluating and ultimately select align with what it is we're trying to accomplish as an organization. So we have to look at our overall strategy and goals and objectives as an organization and translate those goals and objectives into digital transformation and software evaluation goals and objectives. So again, back to that example I gave earlier, the sort of the extreme example of one single standardized ERP system versus a more flexible best of breed open source solution, let's just say. Those are two extremes, right? Those are two very different impacts on an organization. They have their pros and cons. There's no right or wrong answer, but there is a right or wrong answer for your organization. And so we've got to figure out, what is it you're trying to be when you grow up? If you're trying to, if you're a Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 company, or you aspire to be one, you're multinational, you've acquired a bunch of companies, you're trying to act like one company and really grow up and mature in that way as an organization, then the example of the more standardized single ERP system might be the best way to help you get there. It's going to create the consistency. It'll help you harmonize processes. There are other dark sides to this, of course, but that, the benefits are generally aligned with that strategy in that example. But if that same organization were to say, well, let's go look at best of breed and open source technologies, chances are pretty high that they're not going to achieve what they want, which is to standardize and to create a common operating model, because you're deploying technologies now that are very flexible and they're meant to be changed. They're meant to sort of tailor for different situations, and they're meant to be flexible, which could be good if that's what you want. But if you're trying to standardize and create a common operating model, that can be a challenge. So that's what we mean by that executive and strategic alignment, making sure that we as a team, we as an organization, are all on the same page with what our strategy is and what it means to our software initiatives, so that we can ultimately select and implement the right technologies. And then once we've done that piece where we're looking at the overall strategic alignment, then we get into the current state. How do the current processes work? A lot of people don't want to talk about this because you're going to throw out most of your business processes, or a lot of them. But it's really important from a change perspective to understand where we're starting from. And it also allows us to really hone in on not just what isn't working, what we want to improve and address as part of a software selection, but it also helps us to highlight what we do really well. And I think a lot of organizations forget that there are things we do well. It may be painful at times. It may not always be pretty, but there's certain things we do as an organization that make us unique. It's our secret sauce, our competitive advantage, whatever you want to call it. And it's the reason customers hire us. It's the reason we win business against competitors, whatever the case may be. So we want to understand those things as well, because what you don't want to do is water that down or make it worse, or undermine those strengths that you have right now. So you want to understand both your strengths and your weaknesses, where you want to improve, and really understand where we're starting from before we move into the second box down from on the left side. That's where we move into the future state requirements. So once we've defined the current state, then we spend more time focused on, what are our future state processes going to look like? And we certainly don't define the future state in the transactional workflow level of detail, because that's going to be dependent on whatever technologies you deploy. But you do want to do it from a sort of a macro perspective, end-to-end processes, to understand how data and processes and workflows should work throughout the end-to-end process, regardless of what technologies you do or don't use. There's certain things you just are going to do no matter what, whether you're using a new ERP system or whether you're using a spreadsheet or whether you're using the pen and paper. you're going to do certain things a certain way to help enable whatever service or product delivery you're trying to deliver. Now, certainly technologies are going to help you automate that, and it's going to make you more efficient at that. But you, in general, want to define what those requirements are and what those future state processes are, which then ties to the solution architecture and data assessment. So this is where we look at the current systems, what landscape you have now, which systems are going to stay, which ones are going to get replaced, how they're all going to integrate, and what that future state architecture is going to be. And then we get into the solution evaluation, the long list, the short list, identifying and analyzing those options. And in that box right there, that second one down from on the right side, that's where a lot of organizations really get stuck, and they just don't know which systems they should be looking at, or they're evaluating systems that just aren't a good fit for what their needs are, but for some reason they've been sold otherwise. They think that there's a system that might be a good fit that's really not. So really finding that right short list and finding those 2 or 3 options for any given area that you're trying to automate can be difficult and challenging at times. We mitigate that even for our own blind spots as a consulting team. Even though we do this all the time, it's impossible for any one of us to know everything about every system that's out there in the marketplace. So what we do is we leverage an internal database that has 30,000 different business requirements in it, and it maps those business requirements and the capabilities of those business requirements against all the different systems in the marketplace. So in other words, those 30,000 requirements will have quantitative assessments or rankings based on how well they do those 30,000 things for each of the systems in the marketplace. And that helps us narrow down quickly to a short list, or at the very least, dive into certain important parts of the evaluation with quantitative data and objective data that's meant to balance out the biased data that we get from vendors. So going on to the next box there at the bottom left, that's where you start to get the RFPs and the demos from the vendors. And that's all helpful input, but that's very biased. That's the marketing and sales spin. That's kind of giving you the polished view of what they want to show you. And what we're trying to do with some of the data we bring to the table, and even our qualitative hands-on experience with these different systems, is to really poke holes in the evaluation. Not because we want to be negative, or not because we want to point out everything that's wrong with every system out there, but because it's really important you know what those weaknesses are, not only to help you make a decision, but even if you've already made a decision, you still want to know what those weaknesses are, and you want to poke holes in that solution, because those weaknesses and those gaps are what create potential delays. It creates risk. It creates cost overruns, time overruns, all that stuff. So if you want to have a really good, realistic implementation plan, and we talked yesterday in my presentation about how important it is to have realistic expectations. If you want to have realistic expectations, you have to know both the strengths and the weaknesses of whatever technology you're deploying. And if you're not finding, or you don't know what the weaknesses are of your system, it's not because they don't exist. It's because you have a blind spot. And so it's really important that you know and are very comfortable with the weaknesses of any technology you might deploy, or at the very least what the trade-offs are. And as much as I'd love to say that every company has a perfect answer out there for them, and you just need to hire through a stage to help you find it, it's not true. There's not a perfect answer out there for you. So it's a matter of finding the best answer for you, the ones that are the technology or technologies that are most aligned with what your needs are. And then we get into the selection process. You combine, you consolidate all that stuff that you've gathered in the evaluation process to get to that selection process. And then ultimately you want to negotiate with your software vendor so you're getting the right deal. List prices of technology nowadays are pretty much useless. I mean, it's rare, if ever, that we see organizations actually pay list price for technology. So there's a lot of negotiation that can happen there that can enable better cost savings. And you also want to negotiate with your for the implementation cost as well. So the system integrator or the reseller, whoever's doing the implementation on the technical side, you want to negotiate those costs as well. And then running in parallel, on the left and the right side of the screen, you have that org readiness assessment that I mentioned before, where you do the assessment of sort of the cultural impact, what the change impact to the organization might be, and then you also have the system integrator evaluation potentially, depending on what system you're looking at. If you're, for example, looking at Microsoft Dynamics or SAP or Oracle or any of those big ERP providers, you're generally going to find that there's a lot of different options out there of technical consultants that can help deploy the technology. So you want to find the right answer there as well. So that's a bit of an overview of the general evaluation and selection process and sort of how we walk through it. Generally, if a client's starting at the very beginning and they haven't done any work and they're hiring us to help kind of start the evaluation process from scratch, depending on the size of the company, it could take anywhere from 2 to 3 months for a smaller organization to 6+ months, 6 to 9 or more months for a large multinational organization. So really just depends on the complexity of your organization as well as the scope of what you're evaluating. If you're just evaluating warehouse management or financial system or procurement or whatever the case may be, you might be able to do it a bit sooner or a bit lower than a full-blown enterprise-wide solution. And then some of the software evaluation best practices that are important to keep in mind, I've listed here as a sort of some things to think about. And that is that, and by the way, a lot of this, most of this that you see here on this slide is pulled from the white paper you see on the right side of the screen, 20 lessons from 1,000 transformations over 20 years. And that's a white paper I wrote a couple years ago that you can download off our website. If you just go to thirdstage-consulting.com, go to the resource center, and you can download this full report or paper that I wrote a while back. But some of the highlights from the evaluation process that I pulled from that paper, first of all, make sure you have a clear digital strategy before you start evaluating systems. It's sort of like you're shooting in the dark and flying blind if you don't have a clear vision of what that strategy is. What are you trying to accomplish? Because hopefully it's not just to replace an old ERP system, and hopefully it's not just to go find some cool new technology to deploy in the organization. Hopefully you've got some real strategic goals and expected business benefits and other things that you expect to get out of the technology. You also want to match the software to critical requirements and key differentiators. And that's a really important point that I neglected to mention on the previous slide, in that you want to make sure that you're not treating all your business requirements equally in the evaluation. So in other words, if you have 1,000 different business requirements, you don't necessarily want to do a deep dive understanding of all 1,000 requirements and the capabilities of the technologies that you're evaluating. There's probably maybe 200 of those. If you have 1,000, there might be about 200 that are really unique to you as an organization. There are things that are competitive differentiators, and there are things that you want to make. They're really important to your evaluation process, and they meet that criteria. And they also should meet the criteria of, they also are differentiators among the different systems in the market. So in other words, you might have something that's really important to you, but most technologies in the market are going to be able to handle those capabilities fairly commonly or equally. So you don't want to spend too much time on those. You want to focus more on those things that are big differentiators between the systems and are important to you. So that's really important, and that will help focus the evaluation. It'll help speed things up. It also helps ensure that you don't get caught up in that analysis paralysis that I talked about before. You also want to make sure you don't waste time on non-essential requirements. So it's easy to do because a lot of organizations want to involve people. You want to get people's feedback. You want to hear them. You want to understand what their needs are in terms of what new technology might be able to help them. But at the same time, you want to walk that fine line of involving people, getting their buy-in, but also recognizing that, like I said before, not all business requirements are created equally in the evaluation process. So once you have that laundry list of requirements, it's really important to narrow that down to the ones that are most critical to the evaluation process. The other thing is that price shouldn't be the only determining factor. And it's rarely the most important for most organizations for a couple of reasons. One is because if you're going to spend time and money on a project of this magnitude, then chances are pretty high that you're going to invest in any incremental savings wouldn't be enough generally to lead you to a certain solution. But having said that, we tend to try to get very aggressive in our negotiation process to make sure that our clients get the best possible deal. And usually, if you find a solution you like, and it's the high cost option, or you have a lower cost option out there, usually you can negotiate away that delta in most cases, maybe not entirely, but you can at least get it close to where you don't have a huge discrepancy in cost scenarios. I think the bigger thing you have to worry about is just making sure you have a realistic proposal from your vendors, and that you're comparing apples to apples when you look at proposals, because sometimes vendors will cut the scope, they'll cut out modules or things that they know you need, but in order to get the cost down to be the low cost provider, they might cut down the scope. Or, the even more common thing is that on the implementation side, when you get into the vendor or system integrator who would be doing the technical implementation, oftentimes they'll lowball the estimate. They'll come in with an unrealistic number, which again, back to unrealistic expectations. That's where a lot of those unrealistic expectations come from, because their job is to deploy technology, but your job is to transform your business. And those are two very different things. And sure, maybe they can deploy technology in 6 or 9 months or whatever number they're giving you, but to totally transform your business, it might take you 18 or 24 months. So you've got to figure out how to reconcile that and say, okay, the technical vendor is telling us this. So how do we bake that into an overall broader program that might elongate their work stream, but it also looks at other work streams that need to be considered as well. You want to make sure you have a business case. I don't know why this is, but over the last 5 or 10 years, it feels like, and I have no data to back this, this is just more of a qualitative feeling I have as a consultant or observational data point. And that is that it seems like more organizations are bypassing the whole business case process than they did 10 or 20 years ago. When I first started my career, it seemed like more companies were doing business cases, but for some reason lately, it just hasn't been a priority. I think it might be because so many organizations are being triggered, or the catalyst for their transformation in the evaluation process is the fact that their old software is outdated and it's being sunset, and they really have no choice. They have to go forward with something. So they have this mindset that, well, I don't need a business case because I have to do something. So let's just go pick some software. But that business case is really important. Even if you know you're going to do something either way, you still need that business case for a few reasons. One is because you have different business case scenarios that might attach to different technologies or different roadmaps that you look at. So you can have different cost profiles. You have a different benefits outcome that would be expected. So you need that business case to really compare, what's the ROI of these different options we're looking at. And the business case is also important from a governance perspective when you go to implement, because when it comes time to make decisions around whether or not you should customize or whether or not you should add new modules or take advantage of new functionality that the software is trying to sell you, or that the software vendor is trying to sell you right in the middle of the implementation, you need that business case to be sort of your North Star to help you make decisions to say, does this incremental cost and impact to the project, can it be justified by something in the business case? And if not, then you probably bypass it. And if it does, then maybe you do, allow for the scope creep or the increase in cost or the added modules or whatever the case may be. And then finally, the business case is also important from a benefits realization perspective post-implementation, so that you can measure actual results and then modify and pivot where you need to ensure that you're optimizing those results, because you're not going to get the expected benefits on day one. So you can use that business case to help you drive and optimize benefits over time. So that business case is really important to the entire cycle. So you might as well just do it in the selection process to get the benefit of being able to evaluate systems more quantitatively. And then you want to look for the best software, not a perfect fit. Don't expect that there's any solution or option or roadmap out there that's going to give you a perfect fit, because it won't. And every solution out there, every alternative you consider is going to have downside risk. And it may, in some cases, feel like it's the end of the world and the sky is falling and it's a deal breaker. Other cases, it might just be that, you're making a trade-off. You're trading one risk for another. When you're evaluating systems too, don't get caught up in best practices. I think I mentioned in yesterday's presentation about the whole myth of best practices that they simply don't exist. There is no such thing as best practice. What there is there's best practice for your organization, whatever it is you're trying to do. If you just think about it, if you step back from technology and just think about the term best practice, it doesn't really make any sense, because if best practices were real, then every company in any given industry would operate the same and no one would have any real advantage. So we're all, as organizations, we're always trying to get a leg up or do things differently and try to be more competitive or be better than our peers. And so that dynamic just totally demolishes the whole concept of best practice. They don't exist. Now, in some cases, you might have some sort of commoditized business processes that are lower value, not low value, but lower value to the overall competitive nature of your business, or most organizations do things a certain way when it comes to processing invoices or accounts payable processes, for example. So yeah, there are best practices that might apply there, but when it comes to your manufacturing process or how you service your customers, how you provide estimates or quotes, all of that is going to be somewhat unique to you, and it should be somewhat unique to you. So you want to make sure you don't just defer to the vendor and assume that they're going to have the best practice, because you need to figure out what yours are. And then finally, you want to make sure you don't overlook the software cultural fit. So, I mentioned before, the idea of a standard rigid system versus a more flexible open system. What kind of impact does that have on our business, both good and bad? That's something we need to understand as part of the evaluation process. So again, as we go through here, as we get to the next slide here, feel free to chat any questions you have. So if there's anything that you want me to dive into or you want to follow up on question-wise, feel free to dive in here as I'm talking. So just to unpack this current state assessment concept a little more, this is a process we go through when we are looking at those different business processes and the way they are today. So generally, we start with the high-level process flows. We're not getting into a ton of detail. We're not sitting side by side with employees to look at how, what buttons they're pressing and, what fields they fill out in every screen. We're not getting down to that level of detail. We're at that macro view of end-to-end processes when we're looking at current state. And within that, we want to identify potential improvements. So where are those pain points? What are the things that are inefficient, the manual redundant processes, those steps where you revert to a spreadsheet or you go manipulate data in a spreadsheet and then you bring it back into the system, or you go to another system to pull data and then re-enter it in the core system. You want to talk through those sorts of bottlenecks and pain points. And that usually is a source for it's sort of a gold mine for potential improvements. But you also want to look at, more forward thinking re-engineering opportunities too. How can we rethink the way we're doing business in general? Aside from alleviating pain and making things more efficient, how can we just rethink our business model and the way we're operating? And how could technology in general potentially help us get there? So that's why defining that future state too is so important, because if you have ideas of how you want to use technology or how technology could help you do business better, you want to translate that into business requirements to help you evaluate the right solution. So defining those potential improvements are typically a good input into those requirements. As well as assessing your data, your systems, your infrastructure. So understand, what systems you've got, what you might need to integrate to, how data might flow between systems. That understanding is important to make sure you're finding the right system that fits those needs. And then finally, identifying potential risks. Like I said before, every solution has its risks. So let's make sure we've identified them. And if you're going forward with a recommendation or with a alternative that you're considering and you haven't identified risks or you don't think those risks exist, I would go back to the drawing board and ask yourself again, what are the risks here? What are we missing? Because there are risks in any implementation you do. And the key there is, by the way, not just identifying them, but also identifying what the mitigation plan is. How do we overcome that risk? It may be something that's a deal breaker that affects or changes the outcome of our evaluation or selection, but it may be that it doesn't change the outcome of our selection, but it does affect the way we manage the transformation in the process going forward. So I mentioned before about how we use a database. You've got RFIs, RFPs, you've got demos, you've got all these inputs to help you get to a long list as well as a short list. So, long list, oftentimes you try not to, we recommend typically that if you're looking at any given functional area, whether it's a full-blown ERP or whether it's human capital management or CRM or supply chain, warehouse management, whatever it is, I would generally say that your long list, in most cases, if you're getting over, more than 5 or 7 different systems or options you're considering, you're probably considering too much. There's probably something you're missing in terms of lack of fit and the ability to kind of throw out the ones that aren't good fits and focus in on the ones that are better fits. And then if you get to a short list of anything more than 2 or 3, same thing. You probably, you want to narrow it down as quickly as you can so that you're not wasting time analyzing and getting demos and stuff from systems that just were never a good idea in the first place. So that's hard. It's hard to do because you go to the websites, you watch YouTube videos, and a lot of the systems out there, you might find 10 or 20 systems that look like they're great fits for you. And how do you make sense of it all? So that's where narrowing it down to that short list is so important. And again, you really want to focus on those critical business requirements that are unique to you and differentiators between the different systems in the market. That's probably the best way to narrow down quickly. And you want to be objective about it too. Obviously, you don't want to rely solely on what the vendors are telling you. And it's also difficult because if you rely on industry analysts like Gartner and Forrester, those guys are paid by the vendors to do the studies that they put out, the quadrants and all that stuff. So that's biased as well. So you can use it. I mean, obviously you want to use that stuff, but you also have to take it with a grain of salt and know that that stuff is oftentimes biased or compromised in terms of being objective. It's weird. I can't see Kyler anymore, but I know she's there in the background adjusting the slide. So it's kind of a strange feeling. And she's in an office just two doors down from me, but I can't see her here, which is weird. So the solution evaluation, I kind of talked about this already, but some of the things you consider in your long list would be the key differentiators, the unique requirements, industry vertical focus, someone that plays in your space and has good case studies and good functionality, of course, within your space is very important. You want to look at your regulatory needs, the geographic capabilities, if you're a global organization, or if you're just in a region that maybe certain vendors aren't as prominent as others, you want to take that into consideration as well. And it's not just whether or not the vendors are prominent or have a footprint in your region. It's also, do you have technical resources that are specialists in that technology in your region, or how widespread are they? And then also, one thing I didn't mention is it's typically valuable to consider your incumbent. Whatever system you're using now, let's just say you're using Microsoft Great Plains or Microsoft Navision or Exapta, one of the Microsoft legacy products. As much as your people may hate the system and just be done with the whole Microsoft platform in this example, you still want to consider Dynamics 365 as a potential path, because oftentimes that's going to be a path of least resistance. Oftentimes that may be your lower cost option, may also be your lower business value option, but generally that lower cost option could be at least worth considering. And then it may be that you look at other options that might be higher cost, but they could be potentially higher value and deliver a higher ROI if you went to a different platform. Not always, but sometimes. So looking at your incumbent or considering your incumbent is important. And then when you get to your short list evaluation, that's where you want to do the requirements mapping, the vendor discovery, due diligence with the vendors, talk to references, look at the cultural fit, the technical fit. Technical fit's another important one. If you've got, if you're a Microsoft shop, in my Microsoft upgrade example, if you're a Microsoft shop and you've got a big IT staff and they're all sort of Microsoft certified, they're familiar and comfortable with the Microsoft ecosystem, you want to consider that. It doesn't mean you necessarily need to stick with Microsoft, but it does mean that there's a organizational change advantage potentially to staying in the same ecosystem or staying with an incumbent vendor. Or it could mean if you go a different direction, it just means that there's added hidden costs there associated with upskilling and or replacing those resources that you would presumably need to do so with if you went to a different platform. So you want to make sure you sort of look at that full picture and understand that technical fit, not just from a system landscape and architecture perspective, but also from a human organizational infrastructure perspective as well. So the solution evaluation process, this is where, you prepare demo scripts. And if you don't plan to have demo scripts, I certainly recommend that. Demo scripts should help you sort of even the level or create a level playing field so that you're comparing apples to apples, and so that you're letting the vendor show the product in a way that's more of a day in the life of your organization using their technology, rather than a sales pitch or a sales and marketing dog and pony show. You really want to make sure, usually what we do is we give people, the vendors, a chance to sort of do their overview, tell us whatever you want about how great your system is. You do that in the upfront part of a demo, but then the rest of the day, 90% plus of the demo would be focused on our scenarios. This is how our business runs. Let's see how the technology would fit within that. So those demo scripts are really important to help see, more practically how the technology can be used in the way you would use it to run your business. You generally want to complete discovery with the vendors, make sure they understand, all the business requirements, understand your needs, all that stuff. And that's a role we play with our clients. User training, make sure that people understand what to expect in the demos, how to score the demos. We'll provide a demo scoring tool. It's an online web tool that people can do from their phone or laptop or whatever, to provide their quantitative assessment of how well the product meets each of those different processes and requirements. And then we do the on-site demos, proposal requests, et cetera. And I included this cartoon here, which we post on social media occasionally, which is, and it's just in this particular cartoon is picking on SAP, but you could actually insert a number of different vendors on the right side of the screen there. But what you see oftentimes is vendors and sales reps who will sell you a bill of goods that hasn't yet been created, or it's in the process of being created. So it's amazing when you get through demos. A lot of times you'll ask questions about, can your software handle capability A, B, and C, A, B, or C? And a lot of times they'll say, yes, with our new release that's coming out this summer, we're going to address that. Okay, well, it may come out this summer. Even if it does come out this summer, you're not seeing it. You have no idea what that's going to look like or whether or not it's going to work. So you really have to be aware of like the reality of today versus the product roadmap sorts of vision, the visionary types of discussion. And vendors are generally really good at sort of painting the vision of their roadmap. And here's what we're doing. And here's all the great enhancements we're making, all the R&D we're doing. So they do generally have a pretty solid roadmap or a clear roadmap. But the question becomes, well, how real is that? And how does it apply to our organization? So you want to make sure you're not buying something that is sort of like the software on the right side of the cartoon where they're building it for you and you're sort of the test case, or you're one of the first to use it, or it just doesn't work flat out. And that's the even bigger risk that we see with a lot of the leading software vendors right now, because they're making this shift to the cloud right now. A lot of these vendors that weren't native cloud solutions, now they're trying to figure out, how do we take these 20 or 30 years of R&D we had on-prem, how do we now migrate it all to the cloud into our SaaS or cloud-based solutions? And obviously that doesn't happen overnight, and it's going to take years for these vendors to get caught up to where they were pre-cloud. So you just have to be aware of that and understand what's happening behind the curtain. Are you really getting what you think you are? And that's one of the bigger risks that we see right now. So then we, as part of the vendor selection, that's where we get into the proposal analysis, demo follow-up. We get into the business case analysis, as I mentioned before, references, calls, and visits, the technical validation, and then the overall risk assessment. That risk assessment is really important. Again, you have to watch that dynamic that happens in software selections where people become very enamored by a certain technology, especially when you start leaning towards your preferred solution. People get really excited to the point where oftentimes they don't want to hear or see the stuff that isn't a good fit, because it's that, what's that called? The confirmation bias that humans have. You want to, once you've sort of made a decision or you think you're leaning a certain way, you look for things that are going to confirm that decision. You're not looking for things that might undermine or cause you to doubt that decision, nor should you necessarily doubt the decision unless you're just completely off base. But you do need to look at, what am I missing here? What are the risks, and what are some of the challenges that the organizations are facing? So the closing the deal then is another important aspect here. You want to make sure you have a clear negotiation strategy. You want to be clear on your licensing needs, understand what you're buying. There's two risks with the licensing and buying the right licenses or subscriptions for the technology. One risk is that you don't buy the modules that you think you were getting. So, the vendor demoed a bunch of cool capabilities and functionalities for you, but when it comes time to look at the contracts either through error or intentional trying to undercut competition purposes, those modules aren't all included in what you're buying. So that's one risk. The other risk is the opposite, which is the vendor throws in a bunch of stuff that you don't need. They offer you a sweet discount to sign by tomorrow to get every module under the sun, and you don't end up using 80% of it. So that's the other risk. So you've got to walk a fine line there, and that's generally what we help our clients with. And then Marcus Harris, who's part of this event and one of our sponsors with Taft, is another resource that can help in this process, more from a legal perspective and T's and C's and dotting the I's and crossing your T's perspective. You also want to watch for changing user accounts. What happens as we add new users in the future. One of the brilliant aspects of the cloud subscription model from a vendor perspective is that they kind of lock you in, and then they can increase your costs pretty significantly over time. So you're locked in and they're escalating costs. You might have a steep discount to get locked in the first place, but then as you add users, there's escalators and things that kick in that can really ramp up your cost, which is part of the reason why cloud solutions are more expensive. And I did say that correct. They're more expensive than on-premise, despite what the industry might tell you. It's absolutely true that you're going to spend more on cloud than you, generally speaking, than you do on-premise. You also want to look at the benefits and risks of multi-year SaaS commitments. So a lot of vendors require you to lock in for at least 3 years contractually. But the reality is, once you get past 3 years, and even if you could cancel the contract, it becomes very difficult to get out of it, because Now all the data is in the system. You're obviously, you've integrated the system into your organization, into your operation. So it's very difficult to change once you get going. So you want to make sure you understand those benefits and risks of that potential long-term commitment. You also want to look at capping fees and termination conditions. How can I get out of this if I need to? You also want to negotiate for the implementation experience as well as the relationship as well. That's an important part of that. And then you also want to seek specific experience, people that have done this before and have been through the process. And then just some key truths that I point out in this video that you see on the left on my YouTube channel, which, by the way, if you don't subscribe to my YouTube channel, I encourage you to do so. I put out two new videos a week, and in addition to 2 podcast episodes a week, and including a live stream within that. So be sure to check out my YouTube channel. But one of the videos talks about some of the truths behind software selection and the types of questions you should answer. And some of the things that, some of the takeaways from that video and from that research paper I shared on a previous slide is that you want to make sure you don't succumb to analysis paralysis. Nothing's going to be perfect. So make sure you find the thing that's best for you, but don't expect it to be perfect. Your business processes are going to change, but your fundamental business model likely isn't, unless you're in a highly disrupted industry like retail or healthcare, 2 good examples right now where they absolutely do need to change their business models. Healthcare with telehealth, for example, or retail shifting or continuing the shift from bricks and mortar to e-commerce types of capabilities. So in some cases, the business model is changing because you have to, but in general, most organizations are looking for ways to sort of keep up and improve and take their business models to the next level. Also keep in mind that no technology is going to please everyone. You might address 80 or 90% of your needs, but there's going to be parts of your organization that don't like it, especially if you're deploying a single ERP system. That's pretty common. You might find that, 9 out of 10 major departments are on board, but that 1 out of 10 just really doesn't like it because maybe it's just not a good fit for that one department, or there's other systems out there that could do their jobs better. And that's probably true because no ERP system can be everything to everyone, even within your own organization, let alone in multiple companies in multiple industries. You want to use your requirements as the guidebook, and that cross-functional collaboration and defining the requirements are critical. And then you also want to make sure you have a healthy level of professional skepticism, which is a buzzword that Kyler invented herself, and I love it. So I'll continue to use it here. That professional skepticism is important with your vendor communication to make sure that you're building relationships, you're looking for the positive, but you're also looking for, the blind spots that you might have in the evaluation and the implementation as well. So this is our contact information again. If you need to reach any of our local offices, you can reach us at the numbers here, or if you don't feel like writing this down or getting a screenshot, you can just email info@thirdstage-consulting.com. We'll get that routed to the right person or people. This is my contact info. Be sure to follow me on social media. Feel free to reach out if you want to chat more. Social media is a good way just to stay connected day to day. And then my podcast with Kyler and both of them. So Kyler and I have 2 podcasts. We publish a long form weekly podcast called Transformation Ground Control. And then we also have a shorter bite-sized podcast, 3 episodes a week, called Digital Stratosphere. So those are like 10 to 20 minute segments versus 1 to 2 hour segments on the Transformation Ground Control, which are deeper dives, discussions, and interviews and whatnot. So be sure to check those out and subscribe. And I'll stop there and see what questions you all have.